I'm Ricky.
And I'm Joe. And this is Season 4, Episode 9 of the Beer and Broadband podcast, slated to come out on July 19th, 2021. I think that's the right date. Anyways, it'll come out somewhere around then. And we are going to be drinking my accidental brewer, Deja Brew. So this is a mead that I made that is a Coffeemel. It is 16% ABV. It is an orange blossom wildflower mead mix, and it has coffee as a adjunct in tertiary. So I put it in there, and as opposed to the other Coffeemel that I made, this one, while it's not, I wouldn't say it's perfect. It like got the coffee flavor without some of the like off weird flavors that you get from putting it in primary. And it also didn't make it as acidic. This is also probably a sweet mead is what I would refer to it as. So go ahead and give me your take on it, and I'm going to be harsh on this one because so
I will say for me, this is actually really good. This is pretty much like, if you ever had what's, a straight mead, no real other flavors, it's just like the honey distilled down, some of it left behind. It's got all those classic mead flavors with just that little bit of coffee in it. So like, it's not a super strong coffee flavor. It's not the same as like when you get like a coffee stout or something like that. But I kind of like that because, I do drink my coffee black most of the time, but like, that coffee is not my favorite flavor. Like, if the primary flavor to this was coffee, not honey, I'm not sure I'd like it as much, But in all honesty, like where it sits now, like I finished mine really quick.
Yeah,
I'd drink a bottle of that. It's got just that like little bit, extra. Like we're gonna like play some D&D after this. I'm probably gonna have some at D&D.
That sounds like a fantastic idea, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
So I drank a bottle of this a while back, like a couple weeks ago, and it is a lot of caffeine, just to let you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So drink it during the day. Don't drink it closer to night. But the mead itself, the base mead, is really good.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't expecting for it to be as good, and it's a base mead that I made off of an experiment, which is yeast starter versus yeast sprinkle. And that's on that accidental brewer channel that I have on YouTube. So it really ended up being a really interesting kind of outcome. I'm not going to say exactly how that turned out because I don't think I've published the videos on it for the final part of it. But it's an interesting outcome. All of the meads out of it turned out really good. None of them turned out bad, is what I will say, just as a kind of prologue to it. But I didn't like this thing went like way higher than I thought it would. To 16%. I'm not even sure that. So my wife helps me write these labels. I might have told her the wrong thing because I thought it was only 13%, but it might be 16%. Who knows? I mean, that 3% ABV is not a huge amount. It doesn't change the flavor, and that's all that matters. I don't care if it's 10 or 16%. It's all about the flavor. But the wine itself is really delicious. It's very sweet. I back sweetened it to a certain point after I stabilized it, and it's like it's a very, very sweet wine. And at first, when I put this in, it was terrible. Like the coffee flavor was so overpowering. But now there's like these buttery notes that you kind of get afterwards. You get all the nuttiness and the roastiness of the coffee without any of that like kind of like weird acidic flavor. But I treated it like cold brew. Is the whole thing, like at the end. And that is how I'm going to make my Coffeemels from now on. I don't know that I'm going to put it in orange blossom honey, though, because I thought it would kind of be like orange juice and coffee, like, when you have them in the morning, like for breakfast. And I kind of enjoy that. But now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think that that's really the flavor profile I should be going for.
Yeah,
with this.
I can see what you're saying with that. There's certainly a citrusy flavor that comes with that. I also find, even though like in terms of gravity and bricks, I don't believe orange blossom honey is any sweeter than like wildflower honey. But because it's got those like citrusy notes, it tastes sweeter.
Yeah.
So I can see that shift. But in all honesty, man, I gotta say, I've not really had a Coffeemel I liked. Because most places try and really put that coffee front. And it's like you're drinking coffee with some mead sweetness. I like this kind of setup better, where you've just got a nice, plain, well-made mead that instead of where people would normally put like some spices or herbs or some fruit to give it some extra flavor, it's just got that little coffee flavor in it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. I was pleasantly surprised as to how this turned out when I broke out a bottle. Just 'cause I was just like curious what it was like after. I think it's been like 3-4 months since I put it together, and it's mellowed nicely. It's very good. The recipe for that's on the other channel, but basically you just make a high like sack mead style. You step feed a mead to get up to a certain point. You have to do all the the additions to make sure that it's got the right nutrients and stuff.
Yeah.
And then once you do that, you set up the cold brew, and I think I did in 1 gallon I did 75 grams of Pike's Peak roast Starbucks coffee that I ground myself.
Okay.
Yeah, and that ended up being really good. I'm very happy with it. So. Well, let's talk about pressure fermentation with Spunding valves. Have you done any research on this?
Oh yeah. In fact, I knew about it before I saw it on there.
Yeah.
I want to say like it's a hot topic. It used to be like a little controversial, but that's kind of all gone away. Like when I first started making mead in like 2013, I knew about it, and some people were for it or against it. But it kind of seems like most people have come to the conclusion now it's a pretty dang good way to do things, as long as you like take the right steps.
Right. So you can't just put a Spunding valve on. Well, so for people that don't know what a Spunding valve is, it's a valve that will release CO2 or any other gas when it reaches a certain pressure within a fermentation vessel. So, for instance, if we're talking about like a fermentation vessel, like a Firmzilla or something like that, it has to have a little bit of head to be able to have that gas area on it. And it's a great way to carbonate while fermenting and ferment like lagers or colder temperature things at a higher temperature, because you don't get those weird flavors that you would get if you fermented at a higher temperature naturally, like normally. Well, it's normally, not naturally, with just airlocks and stuff like that. So, I've been thinking about getting one. They're not very expensive. They're like $30 to $50, and just throwing them on one of my gallon fermentations for beer, and see how that turns out. And most people like Kveik yeast for this, but I've thought like, what if I did that with a mead?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, as long as you're putting it in
mead.
like a keg or something, it doesn't really matter.
Well, as long as it's a vessel that can handle pressure, you can do it. So I could get like a small Firmzilla or something like that.
Yeah, you'd want it to be something that has emergency relief. That's the only thing about a pressurized system.
That's what the Spunding valve does.
No, it's not. That Spunding valve will, if working, when it hits a particular PSI, release pressure. But those systems can fail. So what you're like, just from a mechanical system standpoint, when you're doing something with a Spunding valve, even if it's just like a little 1 gallon keg or just anything that has one of those emergency, if a pressure hits a certain thing, there's no gauge. It's just like a mechanical lever that flips and the gas shoots out.
Yeah, I'm
Otherwise,
not sure.
you might pressurize something.
I'm not sure that that's the way that it's suggested that you set these things up. So maybe I need to do some more research, because you are right. You want to have some sort of fail-safe on it. But from what I understand, the Spunding valves that you would buy now have that built into them.
Maybe. Though when I looked to see how expensive they were, because I wanted to know like that price point. And the two I looked at both had very large warnings at the beginning. When you put this on something, it needs to have pressure relief. Like it needs to have an emergency relief system.
Okay.
Because it's the same sort of thing with any carbonation. Like you would normally carbonate at a level that can get high in like a glass system. So like you can bottle carb something and oh hey, that might make like, oh actually that's actually a really good way to think about it. You think of like a glass bottle that you put a cap on. That cap is only supposed to go to a certain PSI or it flies off. But we all know that doesn't always happen. Sometimes they're clamped too tight. Sometimes there's some other failure. And now you've got a bottle bomb. And eventually your bottle just explodes. Those sort of relief systems need to always like have a backup just for safety. Especially if you're going to do something large. Like a 1 gallon probably wouldn't get that high. But that's probably still glass failure if you're keeping it on the whole time. The 2 ways that I know people really use these things is they'll either turn it on really soon. So like they'll set it at like a ridiculously low PSI, like 1 PSI from the very beginning. Let that leak out a little bit because you want to push that oxygen that's in the container out. And then they turn it up to their desired PSI. Or they let it like ferment normally, which is like a regular airlock, for a couple days, and when it's getting close to the end, that's when they go in and like put it on with the regular PSI thing. So, if you're doing that second one and you're only putting it on for like the last 2 or 3 days to carb it a little bit before you like move it over to another carbing system, yeah, I could see it maybe isn't as necessary. But if you want it on from the get-go, I'd be a little worried about like pressure buildup.
So the way that I've seen people do it is they have things like Firmzillas, and I don't know everything about a Firmzilla, but a Firmzilla is basically a conical fermentation vessel that has a seal on the top of it, and you either do a transfer system with carbonate, and you carbonate another thing, carbonate another vessel, and then that's your vessel that you're going to transfer into, and that's how you get your carbonation, so you get natural carbonation, or you have a spunding valve on it, and then you go ahead and like set your PSI at a certain level.
Yeah.
And you add a device to it. Now I don't know if the cap on the Firmzilla or some of these other like pressure vessels have like a release thing. I know that my fermentation cap on my CO2 cap on my little gallon kegs. They have like a special pressure release valve that will pop if it gets over a certain amount. So I don't even know if I could do it with a spunding valve. I think that they'll hold more than, I think it's like 20 or 30 PSI before that thing will pop.
Gotcha.
So it may be that all those things have that built into them. I just don't know. But you're not adding a separate piece of equipment to it.
Yeah. The spunding valve you just kind of attach to it. And there's a whole bunch of different connectors for them.
Yeah, and so, but I mean, the ball lock connector is the most common one that people use, and it looks like an amazing way to do beer, and it may be the way that I do beer. If I'm probably going to buy one like in a month or so. I've got 2 beers I want to make. Of course, they're stouts because that's the way I always like to make my beers, right? And I'm going to put that on there and go with it. So. Yeah, I'll let you know how that ends up. I'm hoping it'll end up amazingly.
Yeah.
But
so here's the real question, because this is what some people debate about, is are you going to serve it, like it's already carved, like you're done now, if fermentation's over, it's at the PSI you want, are you going to filter it, or are you going to just leave it where it is?
So I would probably do a pressure transfer to I've got 2 of those kegs. I'd probably pressure transfer to the other one and use a floating dip tube to be able to keep the.
Yep, I can see that absolutely.
And that would end up being my.
Yeah, I think that's the better way to do it, because I worry about as soon as you start seriously relieving that pressure when you're serving it, that yeast is just gonna, unless it's a super tight pack. Again, some yeast are designed to do that, but just like a standard ale yeast, not so much. They've got a little bit of that sediment at the bottom that's not like almost painted on. I just worry that's going to get thrown back up in suspension if you don't do like something like that, where you're transferring it to another vessel. But some people say they don't care about that. There's a lot of people that are like, look, this is perfect, because when it's done, I put a little spigot on it, and boom.
Yeah, so some people like that do hazy IPAs that don't move things around, and that's generally the consensus with those people, because you want the yeast in the hazy.
Yeah.
But the ones that I've seen, they use like a floating dip tube,
Mm-hmm.
and so that keeps it up on the top. It doesn't disturb the lease on the bottom, and it has a lease trap, and so you put this container on the bottom, you turn it on, you flip it, it drops the lease down into it,
Yeah,
flip it.
those things are great.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like, it's probably the direction I'm going in. I'm going to ferment from that, and then I'll do a closed release, or a closed pressure.
Oh yeah,
move.
absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, I've been meaning, that's on my bucket list, and maybe the system you're talking about, I'm not super familiar with it. Maybe that's just like built-in standard, but I love those little like yeast traps at the bottom. Just boop, cut it off, good to go, done.
Well, there's also a way to dry hop your stuff too, if you wanted to. So you can drop your hops down there, purge out the air with some CO2, put it up in the bottom, and then your brew never hits air. And I'm thinking about doing that with not hops, but with wood, like oaking and stuff like that. So I've got some thoughts around how to make that work, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to do something like that within the next year, or so, depending on how things go. I do think that that's kind of the end of our episode, though.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So probably move some of the topics that we had about ubiquity and cleaning bottles to like maybe the next episode or something, depending on how much time we have. But thanks so much for listening. We appreciate you listening. We do have a Patreon and a Twitter and other ways of socially engaging with us that we'd love for you guys to be part of. Otherwise, this has been Season 4, Episode 9 of the Beer and Broadband Podcast, and we'll catch you next time.